Welcome to Nightmare Fuel Stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoy the stories. The Lighthouse Blackrock Point. I've been the keeper at Blackrock Point Lighthouse for 11 years now. 11 years of solitude, punctuated only by monthly supply deliveries and the occasional maintenance crew. 11 years of watching the same stretch of cold Atlantic waters, documenting the same patterns of fog and storm, maintaining the same ancient equipment. It's a life that requires a certain temperament, one that finds comfort in routine, in isolation, in the hypnotic rhythm of the waves against the rocks below. I chose this life deliberately after 20 years in Boston's financial district nearly drove me to madness. The constant noise, the endless demands, the artificial urgency of everything, it was killing me slowly. So when I saw the posting for a lighthouse keeper position, I applied immediately. My lack of experience was offset by my willingness to live in what the Coastal Authority called extreme isolation. Blackrock Point sits on a small, rocky island 3 miles offshore from the main coastline, accessible only by boat, and often cut off completely during the winter storms. It suited me perfectly. The lighthouse itself dates back to 1879, a 70-foot stone tower connected to a modest keeper's house. Despite various modernization efforts over the decades, much of the original structure remains intact. The foghorn is automated now, as is the light itself, but regulations require a human presence to monitor the systems and perform maintenance. I'm that human. I've grown accustomed to the peculiarities of life here, the way the tower groans during storms, the precise pattern of shadows cast by the sun through my kitchen window, the colony of gulls that returns each spring to nest on the western cliffs. I know every inch of this island, every crack in the lighthouse walls, every species of hardy plant that manages to survive in this harsh environment. At least, I thought I did. It was late October when I first noticed something amiss. The weather had been unusually calm for that time of year, the sea flat and gray beneath an equally gray sky. I was in the middle of my morning inspection of the light mechanism when I spotted a vessel approaching from the northeast. This wasn't unusual in itself. Fishing boats occasionally passed within view of the lighthouse, but something about this one caught my attention. It was an old wooden schooner, the kind that hadn't been used for commercial fishing in these waters for at least half a century. Its sails were patched and yellowed, and even from a distance I could see that its hull was weathered to a dull gray. There was something off about its movement, too. It seemed to glide too smoothly across the water, as if it were being pulled along rather than propelled by the wind, which was minimal that morning. I watched it through my binoculars for nearly 20 minutes as it made its way across my field of vision, eventually disappearing around the southern point of the island. I made a note in the logbook, more out of habit than necessity. There was nothing threatening about an old boat after all, just unusual. 3 days later I saw it again. Same direction, same smooth gliding movement, same route past the island. This time I noted more details. 2 masts, what appeared to be 4 or 5 figures moving on deck, no visible name on the hull. Again, it disappeared around the southern point. On the 7th consecutive day of spotting the same vessel, I decided to investigate. I rarely ventured to the southern side of the island during the colder months. It was rockier, more exposed to the elements, and offered little in the way of interesting features. But my curiosity had gotten the better of me. I made my way down the spiral staircase of the lighthouse and out through the keeper's quarters, grabbing my heavy coat and a handheld radio. The path to the southern point was overgrown and slippery with sea spray. It took me nearly 40 minutes to reach the promontory that overlooked the small bay on that side of the island. What I saw there made no sense. The bay, which I knew to be little more than a rocky inlet with waters too shallow and treacherous for any boat to navigate, now appeared much larger and deeper. And there, anchored in its center, was the schooner. Up close, it looked even older and more weathered than I had thought. Its wooden hull was covered with barnacles and seaweed, its deck rails splintered and broken in places. The sails were furled and I could see no movement on board, but what truly disturbed me was that I recognized the vessel. Not from my time as lighthouse keeper, but from a photograph in the small museum in the mainland town where I picked up my supplies. It was the Mary Ellen, a fishing schooner that had gone missing in a storm in 1907. All hands had been lost. I stood frozen on that rocky outcrop, trying to process what I was seeing. It had to be a replica, I reasoned. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to create an authentic-looking historical vessel, but why bring it to this desolate spot? And how had they navigated the treacherous waters of the inlet? As I watched, a figure appeared on the deck. Even from a distance, I could tell something was wrong with the proportions. The figure seemed too tall, too thin, its movements jerky and unnatural. It turned in my direction, and though I couldn't make out any features, I felt with certainty that it was looking directly at me. I backed away instinctively, nearly slipping on the wet rocks. When I looked again, the figure was gone, but the boat remained. I decided I'd seen enough for one day and made my way back to the lighthouse, my mind racing with possible explanations, none of them satisfactory. That night I pored over the historical records kept in the lighthouse. Every keeper since the lighthouse's construction had maintained detailed logs, not just of weather conditions and passing ships, but of personal observations and experiences. I had read through many of them during my first year, but had never paid particular attention to the entries from the early 1900s. Now, I searched specifically for mentions of the Mary Ellen. I found what I was looking for in the log of Thomas Keegan, keeper from 1904 to 1911. November 3, 1907, terrible storm last night, waves breaking over the lower gallery. Spotted a schooner in distress near the southern rocks around midnight, appeared to be the Mary Ellen out of Portland. Sounded the foghorn continuously and lit emergency flares, but fear they were driven onto the rocks. No sign of vessel this morning, have reported to mainland authorities. November 5, 1907, search parties found no trace of Mary Ellen or her crew of 6. Sea has claimed them all. May God rest their souls. November 10, 1907, spotted what appeared to be Mary Ellen passing northeast of island today. Impossible, of course. Effects of too little sleep and too much solitude, no doubt. The entries continued, with Keegan reporting sightings of the vessel with increasing frequency throughout November and December. His writing became more agitated, his normally neat penmanship deteriorating into a frantic scrawl. The final entry, dated January 15, 1908, simply read, "They are coming ashore tonight, they are coming for me." The next entry was from an interim keeper, noting that Thomas Keegan had been found dead at the base of the lighthouse on January 16, 1908, having apparently fallen from the gallery. His death was ruled accidental. I closed the logbook, my hands trembling slightly. The rational part of my mind insisted there must be a logical explanation. Perhaps I had read about the Mary Ellen in these logs years ago and forgotten, and my subconscious had conjured the image of the ship. Perhaps there really was a historical replica visiting the area, and the strange inlet was simply a quirk of the changing tides. But another part of me, a part that had grown more attuned to the rhythms and mysteries of this isolated place over my 11 years here, whispered that something far less explicable was occurring. I slept poorly that night, my dreams filled with images of the schooner and its unnatural crew. I woke before dawn, exhausted but determined to take another look at the southern inlet in full daylight. The morning was cold and clear, the sky a pale blue that promised good visibility. I made my way to the southern point more quickly this time, familiarity with the path making the journey easier. When I reached the promontory, I saw exactly what I expected to see. A small, rocky inlet, its waters shallow and dangerous, with no sign of any vessel. The bay appeared as it always had, nothing like the deeper harbor I'd observed the day before. I felt a momentary relief. Perhaps I had imagined the whole thing, or perhaps the strange light of the previous day had played tricks on my perception. I turned to head back to the lighthouse when something caught my eye, a scrap of weathered fabric caught on a rock near the water's edge. Making my way carefully down to the shoreline, I retrieved the fabric. It was canvas, the kind used for sails, but aged to a deep yellow-brown and brittle to the touch. And there was something else, a small brass button, green with verdigris, bearing an anchor design that hadn't been used by the Navy or commercial vessels for at least a century. I pocketed both items and returned to the lighthouse, my relief now replaced by a growing unease. Throughout the day I tried to focus on my routine tasks, checking the light mechanism, recording weather observations, performing minor maintenance around the keeper's quarters, but my mind kept returning to the schooner and the artifacts I'd found. That evening I examined the items more closely under the bright light of my desk lamp. The canvas was indeed sail material, but degraded in a way that suggested decades of exposure to the elements. The button was even more interesting. The anchor design matched those used by merchant marine vessels in the late 19th century. I had seen similar buttons in the Maritime Museum on the mainland. As night fell, I found myself drawn to the lantern room at the top of the lighthouse. From there, I had a 360-degree view of the surrounding waters. The automated light swept its beam across the dark sea in its familiar pattern, illuminating nothing but empty waves. Until it didn't, at precisely 11:47 p.m., I noted the time instinctively. The light passed over something in the water to the northeast, something that shouldn't have been there. The Mary Ellen, its sails now fully unfurled, was making its way toward the island once more. I watched, transfixed, as it approached. This time I could clearly see figures moving on the deck, at least 5 of them, their movements stiff and awkward. As the vessel drew closer, the light swept across it again, and I caught a glimpse of something that sent a chill through my entire body. The figures had no faces. Where features should have been, there were only smooth, blank expanses like mannequins or dolls. Yet they moved with purpose, working the sails, adjusting ropes, guiding the ship toward the southern inlet. I should have run down to my quarters, locked the door, and radioed for help. That would have been the rational response. Instead, I found myself descending the spiral staircase, grabbing my coat and a powerful flashlight, and heading out into the night toward the southern point of the island. The wind had picked up, carrying with it a damp chill that cut through my heavy clothing. The beam of my flashlight bounced wildly as I hurried along the path, illuminating twisted scrub brush and slick rocks. When I reached the promontory, I shut off the light and allowed my eyes to adjust to the darkness. The inlet had transformed again. Where there should have been a shallow, rocky bay, there was now a deep harbor, its waters black and still. And there, just as I had feared and expected, was the Mary Ellen, now anchored in the center of the harbor. But something was different this time. A small boat had been lowered from the schooner's side, and 3 of the faceless figures were rowing toward shore. Their movements were synchronized with unnatural precision, the oars dipping and rising in perfect unison. They made no sound, no splashing of oars, no creaking of wood, no voices calling to one another. I crouched lower behind the rocks, my heart pounding so loudly I was certain they would hear it. The small boat reached the shore, scraping against the pebbled beach at the base of the inlet. The 3 figures disembarked, moving with that same stiff, jerky gait I had observed from a distance. In the dim light of a cloud-covered moon, I could see them more clearly now. They wore the clothing of early 20th century fishermen, heavy wool coats, rubber boots, knit caps pulled low, but the garments were rotted and draped with seaweed. And their faces were exactly as I had glimpsed from the lighthouse, completely smooth and featureless like eggs, with no indentation where eyes, nose, or mouth should be, yet somehow I knew they could see. And I knew with a certainty that defied explanation that they were looking for something, or someone. They began to move up from the beach, heading toward a path that would eventually connect with the main trail to the lighthouse. I remained frozen in place, afraid that the slightest movement would draw their attention. As they passed below my position, one of them suddenly stopped and turned its blank face upward, toward my hiding place. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, it stood there, its featureless face pointed directly at me. Then slowly a seam appeared where a mouth should be, widening into a gash that split the smooth surface. From that impossible opening came a voice, raspy, wet, like water flowing over stones. "Keeper," it said, just that one word, but it carried with it a weight of malice that made my blood run cold. Then the figure turned and rejoined its companions, continuing up the path toward the lighthouse. I remained hidden until they were out of sight, my mind racing. They knew I was the keeper. They were heading for the lighthouse. And based on what had happened to Thomas Keegan in 1908, their intentions were far from benign. I had to get back to the lighthouse before they did, not to confront them. I had no illusions about my ability to face whatever these things were, but to barricade myself in and radio for help. There was another path, steeper but more direct, that could get me there first if I hurried. I scrambled up from my hiding place and began to run, using my flashlight now, heedless of the noise I was making. The path was treacherous, especially at night, but fear lent me both speed and sure-footedness. I could see the beam of the lighthouse sweeping overhead, a reminder of what was at stake. I reached the keeper's quarters, gasping for breath, and locked the heavy door behind me. Then I ran to the radio set in the small office. "Mayday, mayday, mayday," I called. "This is Blackrock Point Lighthouse. I need immediate assistance. There are intruders on the island. Repeat, intruders on the island." Static was my only reply. I tried again, adjusting the frequency, checking the connections. Nothing. The radio was dead, though it had been working perfectly during my routine check earlier that day. A heavy thud against the outer door made me jump, then another. They had arrived. I backed away from the door, looking frantically around for anything I could use as a weapon. My eyes fell on the old logbooks. Keegan had faced this same threat. What had he done? The logs had ended with his death, but perhaps there was something in his earlier entries that could help me. I grabbed the volume containing Keegan's logs and flipped to the entries from November and December 1907. Scanning quickly, I looked for any mention of how he had dealt with the apparitions. There, an entry from December 12, "They fear the light. When they approached last night, I trained the beam directly on them and they retreated to their vessel. I believe the light reveals them for what they truly are, and they cannot bear to be seen thus. The light, of course. These were creatures of darkness and fog, of the same depths that had claimed the Mary Ellen and her crew over a century ago. The lighthouse's purpose was to guide ships away from danger. Perhaps it could also repel the danger that now threatened its keeper. The pounding at the door grew more insistent. I could hear the wood beginning to splinter. I didn't have much time. I ran for the spiral staircase that led up to the lantern room, taking the steps 2 at a time. Behind me, I heard the door finally give way, followed by the sound of multiple sets of footsteps entering the keeper's quarters. The lantern room was a cramped space dominated by the massive Fresnel lens that magnified the light into a beam visible for miles out to sea. The automated system rotated the lens at a steady pace, sending the beam sweeping across the waters in a regular pattern. What I needed was a way to direct the light downward, toward the creatures that were now ascending the staircase behind me. There was an override panel that allowed for manual control in case of emergency. I had used it during maintenance but never in an actual crisis. I flipped the switches to take manual control, the mechanical gears grinding as the automatic rotation stopped. Now I could direct the beam wherever I wanted. I could hear them on the stairs now, those shuffling, inhuman footsteps drawing closer. I positioned myself at the manual controls, waiting until they reached the final curve of the staircase before I acted. The first faceless figure appeared in the doorway of the lantern room. Its blank face was now split by that terrible gash of a mouth, wider than before, revealing not teeth but something like barnacles or small shells embedded in glistening, dark flesh. "Keeper," it rasped again, reaching toward me with hands that were more like claws, encrusted with the same marine growth that filled its mouth. I swung the beam downward, focusing the intense light directly on the creature. The effect was immediate and horrifying. Where the light touched it, the creature's form seemed to dissolve, revealing glimpses of something beneath the human-like exterior, something composed of writhing tentacles, clustered eyes, and gaping, toothy orifices. It emitted a sound unlike anything I had ever heard, a high-pitched keening that seemed to come from multiple throats at once. It retreated, backing down the stairs, its form flickering between the appearance of a man and the glimpses of the monstrosity beneath. The other two creatures had also backed away, unwilling to face the revealing power of the light. I kept the beam trained on the stairwell, preventing them from advancing again, but I couldn't stay there forever. Eventually dawn would come and the light would lose its power against them, and I couldn't be certain they wouldn't find another way into the lantern room. As if in response to my thoughts, I heard a new sound from below, not from the stairwell, but from outside the tower. They were climbing the exterior of the lighthouse. I swung the beam toward one of the windows, catching a glimpse of a faceless figure scaling the stone wall with inhuman agility. The light struck it, causing the same revealing effect and the same inhuman shriek. It lost its grip and fell, disappearing from view, but there were more of them now, not just the three that had come ashore, but others, perhaps the entire crew of the Mary Ellen. They were surrounding the lighthouse, some climbing its walls, others returning to the stairwell, approaching from all directions. I moved the beam frantically from window to window, driving them back temporarily wherever the light touched them. But there were too many, and I couldn't cover all approaches at once. It was only a matter of time before they found a way in. As I fought my losing battle, a new thought occurred to me. Thomas Keegan had used the light to drive them away, yet he had still died. According to the records, he had fallen from the gallery, the narrow walkway that encircled the lantern room on the exterior of the lighthouse. I looked out at that same gallery now, visible through the windows of the lantern room, and suddenly I understood. Keegan hadn't fallen. He had jumped, choosing death on his own terms rather than whatever fate the crew of the Mary Ellen had planned for him. Was that to be my choice as well, death by my own hand, or capture by these impossible creatures from a ship that should have been at the bottom of the ocean for over a century? No, there had to be another way. Keegan had discovered that the light could drive them back, but he hadn't had time to explore whether it could destroy them completely. I had the advantage of his experience, recorded in the logs. I could take it a step further. The creatures were regrouping, coordinating their approach. Through the windows, I could see more of them scaling the tower. Others were coming up the stairs again, moving more cautiously now, but still advancing. I needed to act quickly. I looked at the control panel for the light. Under normal circumstances, the beam was powerful but not blindingly so, designed to be visible for miles without posing a hazard to passing ships. But there was an emergency override, a way to focus the beam to its maximum intensity for short periods. It was meant to be used only in extreme fog or stormy conditions, and only in brief bursts to avoid overheating the mechanism. This qualified as an emergency if anything did. I activated the override, feeling the mechanism beneath my feet begin to vibrate as the light intensified. The beam narrowed and brightened, becoming almost solid in its brilliance. I couldn't look directly at it without risking permanent eye damage. I aimed this concentrated beam at the nearest climbing figure, visible through the eastern window. The effect was immediate and far more dramatic than before. The creature didn't just recoil or reveal its true form, it seemed to disintegrate entirely, its body collapsing into a shower of what looked like black sand that fell away from the lighthouse wall. One down. But the process had taken nearly 30 seconds of continuous exposure, and I could feel the mechanism heating up dangerously beneath me. The warning lights on the control panel were flashing red. I couldn't maintain this level of intensity for long without risking a complete system failure. I had to be strategic. The stairwell was the most immediate threat. If they reached the lantern room, I would be overwhelmed regardless of the light's power. I swung the beam toward the doorway, catching two more of the faceless figures as they appeared. They shrieked and tried to retreat, but I kept the beam fixed on them until they too collapsed into that strange black sand. The mechanism was now dangerously hot, the warning lights accompanied by an insistent beeping. I had perhaps one more targeted burst before I would have to let the system cool or risk losing the light entirely. I scanned the windows quickly, looking for the greatest concentration of climbing figures. There, on the western face of the tower, 3 of them were ascending together, almost at the level of the gallery. I swung the beam in that direction, catching all 3 in its intensity. They writhed and shrieked, their forms flickering between human appearance and the horrific reality beneath. After what seemed an eternity but was probably less than a minute, they too dissolved into black sand. The control panel was now emitting a continuous alarm, and I could smell the acrid scent of overheating electronics. I shut down the emergency override, allowing the light to return to its normal intensity. The alarm continued, but the smell gradually subsided. I scanned the exterior of the lighthouse and the stairwell. No sign of the creatures. Had I gotten them all, or had the survivors retreated to their vessel? I couldn't be sure, and I couldn't risk leaving the lantern room until daybreak. So I waited, keeping the beam moving in its regular pattern but ready to override it again if necessary, despite the risk to the mechanism. The hours passed with excruciating slowness. Every sound, the creaking of the lighthouse in the wind, the distant crash of waves, the normal settling of the old structure, made me start and reach for the override control. But no more faceless figures appeared. As the first gray light of dawn appeared on the eastern horizon, I finally allowed myself to believe I might have survived. I waited until full daylight before cautiously descending the spiral staircase, a heavy wrench in my hand just in case. The keeper's quarters were in disarray, furniture overturned, my possessions scattered, but there was no sign of the intruders. I checked every room, every closet, every possible hiding place. Nothing. Finally, exhausted but needing to know, I made my way to the southern point of the island. The inlet was back to its normal appearance, shallow, rocky, and treacherous. No sign of the Mary Ellen or its impossible crew. But there, on the pebbled beach at the base of the inlet, was a scattering of black sand, already being washed away by the incoming tide. I've spent the 2 weeks since that night repairing the damage to the keeper's quarters and the overheated light mechanism. I've also read through every logbook kept at Blackrock Point since its construction, looking for other encounters with the Mary Ellen and its crew. There have been several over the decades, always in late October or early November, always coinciding with periods of unusual calm before major storms. None of the previous keepers had discovered that the concentrated light could destroy the creatures permanently. Most had simply driven them back temporarily, only to face their return on subsequent nights. Some, like Keegan, had chosen death rather than whatever fate awaited those captured by the faceless crew. I believe I've found a way to end the cycle, to prevent the Mary Ellen from claiming any more victims. But I can't be certain I destroyed all of the crew, and November isn't over yet. Last night I thought I saw lights on the horizon to the northeast. It might have been a passing ship. It might have been my imagination, strained by weeks of fear and little sleep. Or it might have been the Mary Ellen, returning with what remains of its crew. I've repaired the radio and called for a supply delivery earlier than scheduled. I've requested additional equipment, more powerful lights, backup generators, anything that might help if they return. The Coastal Authority thinks I'm being overly cautious due to the approaching storm season. They don't know what waits in the depths off Blackrock Point. Tonight I'll be in the lantern room again, watching the waters. The light will sweep across the waves in its familiar pattern, guiding ships safely past this dangerous shore. And if I see the Mary Ellen approaching once more, I'll be ready. After all, that's my duty as keeper of Blackrock Point Lighthouse, to maintain the light that holds back the darkness, whatever form that darkness might take.